My name is Kevin Bargh, and I am the author of Atheism is Untenable. On this channel, I don't engage in apologetics. Instead, I apply the principles of polemics and skepticism to atheism and the claims made by atheists. This is Justified Nonetheless. Please like, share, subscribe, and turn on those notifications.
If you have a jar, as they do often in contests, full of gumballs, as long as there's gumballs in the jar, the number of gumballs is either even or odd. Now, the default position is to reject both the claim that the number of gumballs is even and that the number is odd until such time as one of those two propositions meets its burden of proof.
Knowledge is canonically regarded as justified true belief, or JTB. To be true, the proposition must conform to reality. To be justified, and here we're talking about epistemic justification, the belief must be in right standing with respect to knowledge, generally held to refer to whether the belief is more likely to be true, which requires evidence, sound logic, and philosophical arguments. Belief is a propositional attitude that can be expressed as SA that P, such that S is aware of P, where S designates the subject, A designates the attitude, that being that the subject finds the proposition more likely to be true than untrue, and P designates the proposition in question. So if the individual finds the verisimilitude, the truth-likeness of a proposition to be greater than 50%, they believe the proposition. And if the individual finds the verisimilitude is less than 50%, they believe its negation. In summary, for something to qualify as knowledge, the subject must think it's more likely to be true than untrue. It must actually be more likely to be true than untrue based on evidence, sound logic, and philosophical arguments, and it must conform to reality. Notice, crucially, that while evidence, sound logic, and philosophical arguments are required for justification, and justification, as well as conforms to reality, is required for knowledge, none of this applies to find a proposition more likely to be true than untrue, read, to believe it. The burden of proof is a methodology for the justification of a belief. Being uncertain, unconvinced, undecided, and unsure are all metrics of justification. Epistemology is the type of logic that applies to knowledge. This can be contrasted with doxastics, which is the type of logic that applies to beliefs. Why does all this matter? There are three epistemological states. I know that the proposition is true, I know that the negation is true, and I don't know either way. This last position can be substantiated by the proposition that does not meet all three of the criteria to be qualified as knowledge under JTB. It has to be justified, it has to be true, and it has to be believed. The claim, then, for which atheists incur a burden of proof is that there are also three doxastic states. I find the proposition more likely to be true, I find the negation more likely to be true, and I find both propositions equally likely. But how do we even go about confirming a lack of belief when we can't directly observe it? Therefore, whenever one appeals to any of these or the burden of proof, they have left the domain of doxastics in favor of epistemology. While evidence, sound reasoning, and philosophical arguments can tell us whether or not a belief is justified, and by extension speak to whether or not it qualifies as knowledge, this information is silent with regard to the presence of belief. It cannot speak to doxastics. In other words, it can tell us what we ought to believe, but not what we do believe. Agnosticism is often misunderstood as a middle ground between belief and disbelief, as if it is the third doxastic position. However, this oversimplification obscures the distinction between epistemology and doxastics. In reality, as noted earlier, agnosticism expresses I don't know is an epistemological position that acknowledges the limits of knowledge without addressing the presence or absence of belief. Since knowledge is canonically defined as justified true belief, S knows that P if S believes P, P is true, and S has justification for P, this definition highlights the importance of justification in knowledge. Agnosticism then is better represented as not K P and not K not P than as not B P and not B not P, or as simply not B P, as it's often expressed, signifying the lack of knowledge, K, regarding both the truth and the falsehood of proposition P. This formulation reveals that agnosticism is fundamentally an epistemological stance unrelated to doxastic positions. The expression not KP and not K not P is more accurate because it acknowledges the absence of justification for either affirming or denying the proposition. Significantly, this allows for both doxastic positions, BP and B not P, to be present, as belief in either can exist without justification, making agnosticism compatible with both theistic and atheistic beliefs. It's important to note that beliefs are private mental events, not subject to direct empirical observation. Their presence or absence cannot be directly tested or evaluated. Instead, we can only make inferences about beliefs based on behavior, action, speech. This means that even if an individual holds a belief, whether it be BP or B not P, we cannot directly know it. The doxastic position of not BP and not B not P, even if it exists, is therefore unknowable. A common avenue of argumentation in favor of this third hypothetical doxastic state of apisticism, or non-belief, a lack of belief as opposed to agnosticism's lack of knowledge, is through the invocation of the famous Gumball Analogy. While the analogy serves as a straightforward tool to illustrate the burden of proof and propositional logic, it falls short when applied to the concept of non-belief, and I'm going to explain why that is. With all the preceding in mind, we will now deconstruct the Gumball analogy, highlighting its numerous flaws and misrepresentations of cognitive processes and belief formation. Problem 1. The analogy misrepresents what belief is. It oversimplifies belief, reducing it to a mere function of evidence or the lack thereof. Belief is a complex phenomenon influenced by psychological, social, and emotional factors. As psychologist William James have noted, beliefs often arise from a combination of elements. Problem 2. The Gumball analogy conflates belief and knowledge, suggesting that belief requires the same stringent criteria as knowledge, which is false. As explained, belief and knowledge are distinct concepts. Knowledge typically requires justification and truth, whereas belief does not necessarily. Problem 3. The analogy incorrectly implies that without some arbitrarily high degree of certainty, belief cannot exist, which is not aligned with how beliefs are formed and held. Belief does not necessitate certainty. One can hold a belief tentatively and with varying degrees of confidence. Finding a proposition to be more likely to be true than untrue at a mere 50.00 ... is as much belief as finding it more likely to be true at 99.999 ... Problem 4. The analogy fails to differentiate between suspension of judgment and the suspension of belief, leading to a false equivalence. Suspending judgment is not the same as suspending belief. Suspension of judgment is a conscious, willful action. It is the recognition that there is insufficient justification for a proposition. Recall that justification falls within the realm of epistemology, not doxastics. Problem 5. Belief often arises involuntarily due to doxastic involuntarism, the idea that we cannot choose our beliefs at will. This challenges the analogy's assumption that one can suspend belief or simply choose to not believe in the absence of evidence. Problem 6. The Gumball analogy falsely presumes that justification is a prerequisite for belief, which does not align with observed human behavior. Beliefs do not always require justification. People frequently hold beliefs that lack rational or evidential support. Problem 7. The analogy's reductionist view fails to account for this cognitive complexity. Our brains process propositions simultaneously, integrating them in complex ways. Belief is the result of System 1 cognition and Bayesian probability, not akin to propositional logic, evaluating isolated propositions individually. Problem 8. The analogy inaccurately portrays belief as purely a conscious logical process. The majority of belief formation occurs subconsciously without deliberate conscious reasoning. Problem 9. The Gumball analogy ignores the diverse influences involved in the formation of belief, presenting a skewed picture of how beliefs are formed. Belief formation involves more than just evidence and reason. Factors such as emotions, upbringing, social influences, and personal experiences all play significant roles. Problem 10. The Gumball analogy neglects to consider the fact that subconscious beliefs significantly impact our cognitive processes. This omission further limits the analogy's applicability to real-world belief formation. Problem 11. The analogy fails to demonstrate an actual absence of belief, instead assuming it. This presumption leads to circular reason, where the analogy begs the question it aims to answer. Problem 12. The analogy becomes a caricature of the complexity and nuance involved in belief formation by oversimplifying human cognition to fit into a neat logical framework. Human cognition and belief systems are far more intricate than the analogy suggests. Problem 13. The analogy doesn't address the potential for the presence of subconscious belief in the proposition in question, or its negation, at all. Yet we know that belief can be held without conscious awareness. And problem 14. The analogy doesn't address actions arising from belief. Belief informs action, and an absence of belief provides no impetus for action. So if, in this hypothetical, one guesses either even or odd, that action must be informed by some unjustified and potentially subconscious belief. While the Gumball analogy is useful illustrating the aspects of propositional logic and the burden of proof, it falls short in explaining the nuances of belief and non-belief, if there is such a thing. It misrepresents belief, conflates distinct concepts, and oversimplifies human cognition. A more accurate understanding of belief formation must consider psychological, social, and subconscious factors, recognizing the complexity of human thought processes. The Gumball analogy, while critically examined, reveals itself to be inadequate for addressing the rich, multifaceted nature of belief. The act of calling a coin toss in the air delineates the distinction between the epistemological position of agnosticism and the hypothetical doxastic position of apisticism or non-belief, and undermines the validity of the Gumball analogy. People don't say, "I don't know," when asked to call the result in the air, even though that's obviously true. They call one side, and the action of calling one is informed by an unjustified belief in the side called, more likely formed by a bias of some kind. The Gumball analogy is presented in this way. If you have a jar full of gumballs, the number of gumballs is either even or odd. Now, the default position is to reject both the claim that the number is even and the claim the number is odd until such time as one of those two propositions meets its burden of proof. The problem is that, as previously noted, the burden of proof is a matter of justification, and that is a prerequisite of knowledge. Similarly, rejecting the claims, a willful action, is an acknowledgement that belief in either claim is unjustified, which again is a prerequisite of knowledge. Therefore, the very presentation of the analogy in the service of substantiating a difference between non-belief and disbelief results in a false equivocation of doxastics with epistemology, belief with knowledge, apisticism with agnosticism, the suspension of belief with the suspension of judgment, and the justification of belief with the presence of belief. The analogy begs the question with regard to the absence of belief in a proposition as distinct from the presence of belief in the negation due to a fundamental misrepresentation of what belief is and how it works. Because belief isn't a choice and justification isn't a prerequisite for its presence, an absence of belief in an unjustified claim is an ought. But the analogy treats it as if it were an is. Matt says, you either believe something or you don't, and you can become convinced for good reasons or for bad reasons. Now, I'm not a fan of the usage of the word belief and convinced here because I think the former can become confusing and the latter conflates the thresholds of certainty to be convinced with that of belief. So I'll rephrase it to this. You either find something more likely to be true or you don't, and you find something more likely to be true or than untrue for good reasons or bad reasons. I don't think that changes the meaning of what was said at all. Among the good reasons for believing a proposition are evidence, sound logic, and philosophical arguments. Beyond these, other factors involved in belief formation include beliefs, biases, other cognitive functions, cultural influences, emotions, personal experiences, pre-existing beliefs, and social pressures. Biases and emotions would be categorized as bad reasons. The others would be ambiguous depending on the situation. According to the Gumball Analogy, the default position is to believe neither that there is an even number of gumballs, nor that there is an odd number of gumballs, until the burden of proof has been met for one of these two propositions. The catastrophic problem with this rationale is it ignores everything from the bad and ambiguous reasons for how someone can come to find a proposition to be more likely to be true than untrue. This underscores, one, that non-belief, if such a state exists in reality, is an ought. Two, the burden of proof and justification cannot possibly tell us the is. And three, the Gumball Analogy is an abject failure when it comes to substantiating apisticism because it is riddled with problems by focusing on epistemology rather than doxastics, and it doesn't even address either unjustified or subconscious belief. The analogy depends on justification, and as such, it speaks to epistemology. Recognizing the burden of proof has not been met points to the epistemic position of agnosticism. Agnosticism is the default epistemic position. However, agnosticism neither entails nor implies apisticism, which is what the analogy argues for unsuccessfully. Indeed, given that beliefs are propositional attitudes, I don't believe P is as much of an attitude toward the proposition as I do believe P, and that no attitude can arise until after the subject has become aware of the proposition, and that belief isn't a choice. The idea of any default doxastic position is intrinsically incoherent. Or perhaps more accurately, the default position is no position at all, which is the state of innocence prior to having become aware of the proposition. Let's look at the Gumball Analogy as if it were expressed as a logical syllogism. Premise 1, belief should be a proportion to the evidence. Premise 2, the number of gumballs in a jar is either even or odd. Premise 3, the burden of proof has not been met to justify the claim that the number of gumballs is even. Premise 4, the burden of proof has not been met to justify the claim that the number of gumballs is odd. Conclusion, therefore, the default position is to reject both claims and suspend belief until the burden of proof is met. While the conclusion logically follows from the premises for the epistemic position of agnosticism, because of the very nature of belief and its formation, in terms of the doxastic position of apisticism, the conclusion becomes non sequitur. Until next time, remember, even if your beliefs aren't necessarily true, they may just be justified nonetheless.